That morning, I stood at my fence and looked at the windmill my family had kept turning for almost 80 years, lying broken in the middle of my pasture. Vanessa Whitcomb stood on the other side with her arms folded, like she had done the whole neighborhood a favor. She told me the association had removed a hazard because I was too stubborn to take it down myself. I did not argue. I looked at the drive shaft, cut clean in two, and asked her one question. Did she know what it ran? Vanessa laughed at me. 2 hours later, her phone started ringing and never stopped. If you enjoy watching a homeowners association walk straight into its own trouble, hit subscribe and stay with me until Vanessa learns exactly what she broke. My name is Darius Boone. I am 48 years old, and I live on 9 acres of what used to be a 200-acre farm. My grandfather bought that land in the 1940s, when nobody wanted it and the county called it scrub. My father worked it after him, and by the time it came to me, most of it had been sold off in pieces to pay for things families pay for, hospital bills and school, and a roof that would not stop leaking. What was left is called Boone Acre on every county map, and it sits on a low rise of ground with a creek at the bottom and a stand of black walnut along the north line. From my porch I can see 300 feet of split-rail fence, a pump house with a tin roof, and the hill where the windmill stood. On the other side of that fence sits Red Willow Estates, 600 homes with stone entry columns and a gatehouse nobody actually staffs. They came in about 20 years ago, took the old Halloran tract, and built until they ran out of room, and the room ran out right at my property line. Some of those houses cost more than my whole family has earned in 3 generations. There is a house behind me with a 4-car garage and a fountain in the front yard, and the man who lives there waves at me every morning, and I wave back, and that is the whole relationship, and it works fine. Most of my neighbors are like that. They are busy people with jobs and kids, and no particular opinion about my fence line. The windmill sat on the rise about 400 feet behind the house. It was a galvanized steel tower, 26 feet to the platform, with a 16-foot wheel and a tail vane. My grandfather painted white every few years until his hands stopped letting him climb. My father repainted it after that. I repainted it the summer I turned 30. The tower had been rebuilt twice, the gearbox rebuilt 3 times, and the wheel had new sails put on it in the late 1980s when a hailstorm chewed the old ones to lace. It was not a decoration. It was a machine, and it worked every single day, and that is the part Vanessa Whitcomb never once thought to ask about. Under the windmill, a vertical rod ran down inside the tower to a gear head, and from there a shaft assembly carried motion into a low concrete pump house set into the side of the hill. Inside that pump house there were pressure gauges, a control cabinet older than I am, a small auxiliary generator that the mill turned when the wind was steady, and a set of valves that fed a transfer line running north under the tree line. My father maintained all of it. I maintain it now. There is a logbook on a nail by the door with entries going back to 1962 in 3 different handwritings, and mine is the sloppiest of the 3. The letters started about 4 years ago. The first one was polite in that way, where the politeness is the threat. It said the Red Willow Estates Homeowners Association had received concerns regarding a structure visible from several properties, and it requested that I contact the board at my earliest convenience. I called, got a voicemail, left a message that my land was not part of the association and never had been, and did not hear back for 6 months. Then the second letter came, and it was less polite, and it used the phrase aesthetically inconsistent with community standards, which I read twice because I could not believe somebody had typed it about a water pump. Vanessa Whitcomb became president of the board about 3 years in, and the letters changed tone the week she took over. They got shorter and colder, and they started arriving certified. She had a way of writing that made it sound like the outcome was already decided and I was just being informed of the schedule. I looked her up once, not out of any real curiosity, just because I like knowing who I am dealing with. 44 years old, moved from out of state, sold high-end real estate before she stopped working. 3,000 square feet of house and a garden that gets professionally rotated every season. She was not a villain in a movie. She was a woman who had decided what kind of place she lived in and could not stand a single thing that disagreed with the picture. We met face to face for the first time on a Tuesday in April. She parked her car on the shoulder and walked up to my fence in shoes that were never going to survive my driveway, and she called out to me while I was clearing a clogged screen on the intake. I came down the hill wiping my hands on a rag, and she looked at the rag, and she looked at my boots, and I watched her make about 9 decisions about me before I got within 10 feet of her. That is not something you imagine. When you have lived my life, you learn to see it landing. She was pleasant for about 40 seconds. She told me she wanted to introduce herself personally, that she believed in neighbors talking directly, that she hoped we could resolve the matter of the tower without anything unpleasant. Then she said the thing I have thought about probably 100 times since. She said I could live like a farmer if I wanted to, that was my choice and my right, but that 600 other families should not have to look at it. She said it in a warm voice, the way you would tell somebody their shirt was untucked, and she smiled the whole time. I told her the land was mine, the tower was mine, and the tower stayed. She asked what I even used it for, and I said it runs equipment. She said she understood, and I could tell she did not hear a word of it. Then she said she knew upkeep on old property was expensive, and that the association had a fund for improvements in adjacent parcels when those improvements benefited the community appearance, and if cost was the obstacle, she was sure something could be arranged. She was offering to pay me to tear it down. She thought I was poor and stubborn, and that the second one was just a symptom of the first. I said no thank you and went back up the hill. Behind me, she said, in a voice she wanted me to hear, that she would see what the board thought. I remember standing at the gearhead, listening to the wheel come around in a light east wind, feeling the shaft take up the load the way it had 100,000 times before. She had stood 10 feet from a warning sign bolted to my fence post and had not read one word of it. She never asked why a man with an old truck and a leaking roof kept a piece of 1940s machinery, greased, painted, and logged every 14 days like clockwork. She never asked, and I never explained, and I have made my peace with the fact that I could have and did not. The board meeting happened in May, in the clubhouse, and I was not invited to it, but a woman named Denise, who lives on the cul-de-sac nearest my fence, told me everything within a day, because she thought the whole business was ridiculous. Vanessa presented the tower as a community hazard. She had photographs, taken with a long lens from the walking trail, angled up so the tower looked like it was leaning over the rooftops. She used the phrase catastrophic failure event twice. She said the association had a duty to protect residents from foreseeable dangers on adjacent land, and that duty did not stop at a property line drawn on a map in 1946. To their credit, several residents pushed back on the spot. A retired attorney named Paul Ostrander stood up and said the association had no jurisdiction over a parcel that was not part of the plat, and that acting on it would expose every homeowner in the room to liability. Denise said the room went quiet and Vanessa did not blink. She said she was not proposing action on my land. She was proposing an assessment of risk to the community's infrastructure corridor, because the maintenance easement for the northern utility run passes behind the last row of houses, and the tower sits near it. That was the door she found. She could not touch my land, so she talked about a corridor. That distinction is thin enough to see through, but it was enough to get a vote for an inspection, and that is how I met Caleb Finch. He runs the association's maintenance crew, a man in his 30s with a company truck and a clipboard, and the specific tired expression of somebody who takes orders he does not agree with. He came to the fence on a Thursday, And he did the thing I respect, which is he stopped at the fence and called out instead of walking onto my ground. I waved him through. Caleb told me straight what he had been asked to do. Photograph the tower from outside my line, note structural condition, and estimate what removal would involve. He said he was telling me because he did not like being used as somebody's crowbar. I appreciated that, and I told him if he wanted to see it properly he could walk up with me, because a photograph from 400 feet away was going to tell him nothing true. We walked up the rise together. I showed him the tower legs and the anchor bolts, which I had replaced 11 years ago, and the guy wires that were tighter than most guy wires he would ever check. I showed him the gearhead with fresh grease on the fitting. Then I walked him around the base of the hill to the pump house door, and I let him stand there and read the 2 signs bolted to the frame. The old one is enamel and rusted at the corners and says, "Private utility equipment, off-forced access only." The new one, which I put up 9 years ago, says the same thing with the cooperative's contact number under it. Caleb stopped talking. He looked at the door, then up the hill at the tower, then back at the door, and I watched him do the arithmetic. He asked if the mill was tied to the pump house. I said it was. He asked if the pump house was tied to anything else. I said it was tied to a transfer well and a booster station, and that both of those served things on his side of the fence. He wrote that down. He asked me to write it down too, so I did, on the back of one of his forms, and I signed it and dated it, and he said he would put it in his report. He did put it in his report. I know he did because Vanessa quoted a different part of that same report back at me 11 days later, which means she had the document in front of her. What she quoted was Caleb's line about corrosion on the lower tower section, which is a normal note about a galvanized structure that has been outdoors since Truman was president. What she skipped was the paragraph about active utility equipment on the parcel. The ultimatum came certified on a Monday. 72 hours to disable and remove the wheel assembly, or the association would take whatever action it deemed necessary to protect community safety and property values. I read it standing at my mailbox in the rain. I wrote back one word on association letterhead they had enclosed for my response. Because I thought that was funny, and the word was no. I mailed it certified too. Paper is patient. She came out on the 2nd day. She parked in my driveway this time, right behind my truck, and she came up the porch steps without being asked. She looked at the truck and at my boots by the door with 3 weeks of pasture on them, and she smiled the way she did at the fence in April. She asked if I really wanted to pick a fight with an entire homeowners association over a pile of scrap metal. I told her no, I did not want to fight at all. I told her I just did not want her people touching my property. I told her one more time, plainly, standing on my own porch, that the equipment on that hill was live, and that if anybody interfered with it, the consequences would not land on me. She listened to about half of that. I could see her waiting for me to finish so she could say the thing she had driven over to say. She went down the steps and turned around at the bottom, and she said, "Well then, do not blame me when the board handles it itself." Then she got in her car and backed down my driveway too fast, and a piece of my gravel went into the ditch, and I stood on the porch and watched her taillights and knew, the way you know weather is coming, that she was going to do it. I left the house at 5:40 on Thursday morning to drive to a supply yard 2 counties over for a replacement seal and a length of shafting I had been waiting on for a month. It was a 4-hour round trip with the pickup, longer with the stop, and I remember thinking on the way out that the wind was good and the mill was turning nice and steady in the dark. I fed the dog, checked the gauge through the pump house window with a flashlight, and locked the gate behind me the way I always do. The gate has a chain and a padlock and a sign on it, and every single one of those 3 things was ignored before noon. I got back a little after 11. I saw the trucks before I saw the hill. There was a flatbed parked in my pasture with the ruts to prove how it got there. A small crane with its outriggers down in my grass, a cutting rig, and 5 men in high-visibility vests standing around drinking coffee like it was any other job site. The gate chain was on the ground with a fresh, bright cut through one link. My dog was shut in the barn, which somebody had at least been decent enough to do. The windmill was down. That is a sentence I have said out loud maybe 6 times, and it still does not sound like a thing that happened. The tower had been cut through at the second brace and folded over, and the wheel was lying in the pasture on its side with the sails bent under their own weight, and the tail vane my grandfather painted was snapped off and sitting in the mud. The gearhead had been cut free. The drive shaft that carried motion down the hill into the pump house had been severed in 2 places, and the coupling was in a bucket with a bunch of other pieces somebody had decided were scrap. Vanessa was standing at the edge of it in a coat, with the contractor beside her holding a tablet. She saw me park and she came toward me, and she was not nervous even a little. She told me the association had acted under an emergency safety provision, that the structure had been documented as deteriorated, that the crew had been instructed to remain outside the residential setback. Whatever she thought that meant on land, she had no setback in. She said a copy of the board's resolution would be delivered to me. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I know what people expect. I did not yell. I did not get in anybody's face. I did not throw a punch or make a threat or say one word I would have to explain later to a judge. There is a version of me that wanted to, and he was very loud inside my head for about 10 seconds, and then he sat down. Because I have been in this country for 48 years, as a black man on land people keep deciding should be somebody else's, and I know exactly how fast the story changes if I raise my voice. So I took out my phone. I walked the whole site and photographed every license plate on every vehicle, the flatbed, the crane, the 2 pickups, and the contractor's box truck. I photographed the cut on the gate chain and the cut on the tower and the 2 cuts on the drive shaft. I photographed the ruts in my pasture and the crushed section of my fence where the crane came through. I photographed every man standing there and the tablet in the contractor's hand, and Vanessa, and the pump house door, and both signs on the pump house door with the timestamp running. Nobody stopped me. One of the crew asked the contractor if they were good, and the contractor looked at Vanessa, and Vanessa said, "We are finished here," and that was when she made her mistake worse. She looked around at the hill with the tower gone and the sky open over it, and she said, with actual satisfaction, that this place was finally starting to look civilized. I did not answer her. I went to the pump house and unlocked it. The pressure gauge on the primary line had already fallen from 62 to 41. The auxiliary input light on the old control cabinet, which is amber when the mill is turning and green when the electric side is carrying a loan, was red. Red means the controller lost its reference and is running blind on a backup that has a very short life in it. I have seen that light red exactly twice in my life, once during an ice storm in 2009, and once right then. I came out and stood in the doorway. Vanessa was walking back toward her car with the contractor. I said her name, and she turned around, and I asked her if she had any idea what she had just disconnected. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh, that is the thing. It was easy and genuine and a little tired, the laugh of a woman who has been dealing with an unreasonable person all spring and is glad it is finally over, she said. "A windmill, Darius. I disconnected a windmill." I looked at her for a second longer. Then I said, "All right," and I went back inside and closed the door, and I did not say another word to her that day. I called the cooperative's operations line at 11:51 in the morning, and I gave them the site number off the cabinet. And the dispatcher's voice changed halfway through my second sentence, and she asked me to hold. I heard her talking to somebody with her hand over the phone. Then she came back and said a crew was leaving now. The first thing to go was the irrigation on the common greens. Red Willow keeps about 11 acres of common landscaping, 2 entry gardens, a walking trail with beds along it, and 3 ornamental ponds that the sales brochures called water features. All of that runs off a pressurized loop fed from the north side. A little after 1 in the afternoon, the heads on the south green came up, ran for 90 seconds at half throw, and dropped. The sprinkler contractor got a call about it before 2. The ponds went next, in the slow way ponds go. They are not natural. They are lined basins that lose water to evaporation and seepage every hour of every day, and they are topped up automatically from the same transfer line, and when the top-up stops, nobody notices for a while, and then everybody notices at once. By late afternoon, the north pond had dropped enough to show the pale ring on the liner, and the aerator on the middle pond was pulling air and making a sound like a chainsaw drowning. Then the booster station on the north edge threw a fault. That one matters. A booster station is not a luxury item, it is the thing that holds pressure at the far end of a distribution run, and when it loses its supply reference, it does not politely slow down. It works harder, heats up, and then shuts itself off to protect the motor. It faulted, restarted, faulted again, and locked out. 20 minutes later, a second set of transfer pumps north of the tree line dropped into protection mode for the same reason, one after the other, like dominoes lying down. The association office started getting calls around 3. Denise told me later that the phone rang so steadily, the office manager stopped answering and let it fill the machine. Brown patches on a lawn somebody pays $200 a month to keep green. A dead irrigation zone in front of a house that was listing that weekend. A pond smell. A neighbor asking why the pressure in his outdoor spigot had gone soft. Vanessa's position, for the first several hours, was that all of it was coincidence, and that the utility cooperative needed to come fix its equipment immediately. Here is what she did not understand, and what almost nobody in that neighborhood understood, because it happened before their houses existed. When the developer platted Red Willow Estates in the early 2000s, they did not have the rights to draw directly from the old transfer well. That well and its associated works had been permitted and built decades earlier, and the permit ran with the land, and the land was my father's. Rather than fight a permit battle that would have cost them 2 building seasons, the developer sat down with my father and signed an agreement to use the existing infrastructure. The windmill never fed water into a single house in Red Willow. That is the part people get wrong when I tell it. It fed a system. The mill drove a mechanical pump that maintained flow through the transfer well, which kept the well column and the storage stable, and it turned a small auxiliary generator that supplied the old controller with its reference power and kept a set of pilot valves in position. Steady low input continuously, day and night, for as long as the wind blew, and this county has wind. Without it, the transfer well stopped being maintained, the storage side started drawing down, the controller lost its reference and began sending the electric pumps bad instructions, and the electric pumps tried to make up the difference the only way they know how, which is by running flat out against a supply that was not there. Every one of them has thermal and dry run protection built in, and every one of them used it. The system did not fail because the windmill was the only thing holding it up. It failed because the windmill was the thing keeping everything else honest. I knew all of this because my father ran that system for 26 years before there was a single house on the other side of my fence, and because I have run it since. I know which valve sticks in cold weather. I know the controller cabinet has a relay that has to be tapped with a screwdriver handle twice a year. I know the logbook by heart. And the most important thing I knew, standing in my pasture that afternoon, looking at 80 years of my family's work lying in the grass, was the plain shape of the arrangement. The association has the benefit of that water and that infrastructure. The association does not own one bolt of the equipment sitting on my land. It never did. Vanessa had spent 3 years telling people I was a nuisance living next to her community, and she had just cut through the thing her community was quietly standing on. Two trucks from the Hawthorne County Utility Cooperative came up my drive at 2:20, and the man who got out of the lead truck was Graham Keene, an operations engineer I had spoken to on the phone maybe a dozen times over the years, but never met in person. He is a big, slow-moving man with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and he got about 6 steps toward me before he saw the hill and stopped walking entirely. He stood there with his hands at his sides looking at the tower folded over in the grass and the cut ends of the drive shaft shining raw in the sun. Vanessa had not left. Her contractor was loading the last of the cutting rig, and she had stayed to supervise, and she came over expecting, I think, to be thanked for reporting a problem. Graham's first words were not to me. He looked past me at her, at the coat and the folder under her arm, and he said, "Who authorized this?" She answered him with complete confidence. She said the Red Willow Estates Board had voted to remove a deteriorated structure that posed a safety risk, that the work had been performed by a licensed contractor, and that if the cooperative had concerns about scheduling, it should have communicated them. She actually said scheduling. Graham took his glasses off his head and held them for a second like he was deciding what to do with his hands. He asked her if she was aware that booster station B7 had lost auxiliary input. She did not answer. I do not think she knew what a booster station was, and I do not hold that against her. Plenty of people do not. But she had spent 3 years signing letters about equipment she had never once asked a question about. Graham did not wait for her. He asked me for the key, and I gave it to him, and he went into the pump house. He was in there 11 minutes. Through the door I could hear him on the radio reading numbers off the cabinet, and then on his phone with the operations center, and his voice got flatter and quieter the longer he talked, which I have learned is what serious sounds like in a man who does that work. When he came out, he told me 2 more pump groups had gone to protection since he arrived, that the transfer well was down almost 4 feet on the sounding, and that he was going to have to call in a temporary supply arrangement before the evening demand curve hit. Then he asked me, carefully, exactly what had happened. Not what I thought had happened. What happened? I told him I left at 5:40, came back at 11, and found it like this. I pointed at Vanessa and said she sent the crew. She stepped in immediately. She said I had never told the association this was important, that if I had communicated properly, none of this would have occurred, that she had made repeated good faith efforts to work with me. I have thought since about how fast she moved from "this is my decision" to "nobody told me," and how she did not seem to notice she had done it. I did not raise my voice. I walked 8 feet to the pump house door and put my hand flat on the enamel sign that has been bolted there since before I was born: private utility equipment, authorized access only. I held it there long enough for everybody standing in that pasture to read it. Then I went to my truck, took the accordion folder out from behind the seat, and pulled out the copy of my response to the association's second notice, dated 2 years and 4 months earlier. I read the sentence out loud. The windmill and pump assembly are active utility infrastructure. Do not enter or alter the equipment. Then I turned the page and showed Graham the certified mail receipt stapled behind it, signed for at the association office, and I showed him the same sentence again in my reply to the ultimatum, sent 11 days ago, also certified, also signed for. Vanessa said quietly that she had believed I was exaggerating to make them go away. Graham looked at her for a long moment and then went back to his phone without answering, which was, I think, the most devastating thing anybody did to her that entire day. You would think that would be the end of the argument. It was not. By Friday morning, Vanessa had found a new position, and it was the boldest one she ever took. If the equipment on my land served Red Willow Estates, then Red Willow Estates had an interest in it, and an interest meant a right to act. She put that in writing to the cooperative and copied the board, and she used the word stewardship, and I read it twice with my coffee going cold. So I called Lydia Shaw, a real estate attorney in the county seat, who had handled my father's estate and who has a filing system that would embarrass a courthouse. She came out Saturday morning with a document box and spread the whole history across my kitchen table, and for 2 hours we went through it page by page in order, and I watched the shape of the thing become undeniable. The developer of Red Willow Estates never held the water rights they needed. They applied, and the application would have taken years, and the well they wanted to tie into had been permitted to my grandfather and rebuilt under my father's name. So in 2003, they signed an agreement with my father. In exchange for an allotment of flow from the transfer well, they took on a portion of the annual maintenance cost and accepted a defined and limited easement. What Boone Acre kept in that agreement and in every recorded document since is everything that matters: the well station, the windmill and its tower, the pump house and its contents, the transfer equipment, the controller, the valves, the maintenance corridor along my north line, all of it, named item by item, on my parcel, in my family's name. What Red Willow received is one thing: the right to receive water and the right of a utility crew to enter for routine maintenance with notice, not the right to modify, not the right to inspect on its own initiative, not the right to remove, alter, disable, or improve one single component. Lydia read that clause out loud to me twice and then said in her flat courtroom voice that in 22 years of practice she had rarely seen a party so thoroughly outside its own authority. There was a second thing in the file that I had known about and never used. My father, when he signed, insisted on a provision requiring written consent from the landowner for any construction, reconstruction, or structural work on the covered equipment. Lydia asked why he had pushed for that. I told her the truth, which is that my father did not trust a company that had spent 6 months trying to convince him he was too old to understand his own well. For 3 years, Vanessa had told her neighbors a story about me. I heard it secondhand more than once. That I was fortunate the association tolerated a parcel like mine at the edge of a community like theirs. That people like me were the reason values in the western section lagged. That she was being generous by offering to help me clean the place up. The truth was the exact reverse, and it had been sitting in the county recorder's office the whole time, public, indexed, and free to look at. Her clubhouse, her ponds, her entry gardens, and the green lawns she used to measure other people's worth were all standing on an arrangement that ran through my family's land and my family's machine. She came out one more time before the county got involved, and she tried to talk to me about a solution. I stopped her at the fence, which I had never done to anybody before. I told her she could keep calling me an outsider if that helped her sleep. But she had never once bothered to read what her neighborhood was standing next to. Nolan Pierce came out the following Tuesday. He is the county's infrastructure inspector, a narrow man in his 60s with a metal clipboard and no small talk in him at all, and he made it clear inside of 2 minutes that he did not care about anybody's opinion of anybody's landscaping. What he cared about was that an entity with no authority had cut into permitted, operating water infrastructure and taken a county service area down to an emergency posture. He walked the site for an hour and a half. He measured the cuts. He photographed the severed shaft, the gate chain, the crushed fence section, and both signs on the pump house door. He read the logbook cover to cover standing up, licking his thumb to turn the pages, and when he got to my last entry 12 days before the cutting, he made a small mark in his own notes. Then he asked me for every document I had, and I gave him the folder, and he gave me a receipt for it. After that, he went to the association office and requested the rest: board minutes for every meeting where the tower was discussed, the resolution authorizing the removal, the contract with the demolition contractor, and the work order. Vanessa's correspondence sent and received, the inspection report, insurance filings, and every notice the association had received from me, which was the request that made the office manager go very quiet. Caleb Finch called me the day after that, and I could hear it in his voice before he said anything. he had been interviewed. He told Nolan the truth, which was that he had personally stood at that pump house door, read the utility signage, written it into his report, and told Vanessa directly, in a hallway, that in his opinion, the crew should not touch the assembly until somebody from the cooperative signed off on it. He said she told him the board had already made a determination and his job was execution, not analysis. He asked me if I was going to come after him. I told him no. He had warned me, he had documented it, he had said it out loud to the one person who could have stopped it. He was a man with a mortgage taking orders from the woman who controlled his contract, and he made the choice a lot of people make. And he is the reason there is a written record from inside the association proving Vanessa knew. Because that is what all of it came down to in the end. She was not a criminal mastermind, and I have never once described her that way. She was a woman who genuinely believed that being president of a homeowners association meant her judgment outranked a property line, a permit, a state agency, and 80 years of somebody else's work. She did not check because checking was for people who might be wrong. Meanwhile, the cooperative was spending money by the hour. Graham had trucked in a portable pumping arrangement, rented generators, and set up a temporary tie-in with a crew, running 12-hour shifts to hold pressure through the evening peaks. It worked. The homes never lost service, which I want to be clear about, because none of those families did anything to me, and I would not have wanted them to. But Graham told the county what he had already told me. Temporary means temporary. The rental equipment was costing well over $4,000 a day with the crew time on top. The tie-in was not permitted for long-term operation, and the transfer well could not be held stable through a dry August on rented pumps. The only real fix was to restore the assembly on Boone Acre, rebuild the tower, remanufacture the drivetrain, and bring the controller back onto its proper reference. Nolan asked the question everybody in that pasture had been circling for a week. Who pays for that? He looked at his clipboard while he said it, and he already knew, and so did Lydia, and so did I. The party that destroyed permitted operating infrastructure, over written objection, with documented knowledge of what it was, pays for putting it back. The emergency meeting filled the clubhouse. People stood along the back wall and out into the hallway, and I know the fire code number for that room is 140, because Lydia said it under her breath when we walked in. I was invited by the board, formally, in writing. It was the first time I had ever been inside a building I had been told, by implication and once directly, was not meant for outsiders. Vanessa opened by trying to hold the story. She said the removal had been undertaken in good faith for the benefit of residents, that the association had relied on a professional assessment, and that the current service issues were a separate matter being addressed by the utility. She was composed. She had notes. For about 4 minutes it almost worked, because most of that room still did not know what had actually been on my hill. Then Graham Keene stood up in the aisle, and he explained it in the plainest language I have ever heard an engineer use. Nobody asked the association to remove that equipment. Nobody at the cooperative approved it, was consulted about it, or was notified before it happened. The equipment was an operating component of the water system that serves this neighborhood, and cutting it caused the chain of pump failures every person in the room had been calling the office about for 9 days. Lydia went next. She did not argue. She read dates. The date of my first written notice describing the assembly as active utility infrastructure, the certified receipt, the signature of the association office. The date of my second notice with the same sentence, the second receipt, the second signature, the date of the board resolution, the date of the work order, the date of the cutting. The room went completely silent. I have been in quiet rooms. That one had a different quality because 140 people were doing the same subtraction at the same time and arriving at the same answer. A board member named Arthur Reyes asked the question out loud. He asked Vanessa whether she had known it was operating equipment. She could have said a lot of things. What she said was that she had assumed I was exaggerating, that people in disputes exaggerate, and that in her judgment the claim had been a delay tactic. Somebody in the back said something I did not catch, and a woman near the front put her face in her hands. I had not planned to speak. I stood up because I wanted this one thing said in front of every person who had ever heard her version of me. I said, "That was the whole problem, Vanessa. She did not think I was worth believing. Not the paperwork, not the signs, not the certified letters, not the man who had maintained that system for 11 years and whose father maintained it for 26 before him. Everything else followed from that." She did not answer me. She looked at the table. And I sat down, and Arthur Reyes moved that the board go into session on the matter of the president's authority, and the meeting stopped being about my windmill. There was one more thing nobody had said out loud yet, and Lydia said it to me in the parking lot afterward with something close to a smile. To rebuild, the cooperative needed to bring a crane, a boring rig, a concrete truck, and a fabrication crew onto Boone Acre for roughly 3 weeks. The easement permitted routine maintenance access with notice. It did not permit reconstruction. My father's clause required written consent from the landowner for any structural work on the covered equipment. The only person on earth who could sign that consent was me. Vanessa had spent 3 years trying to force me to take that tower down. Now the association could not get its water system made whole until I gave permission to put it back up, on my terms, in my time. She had to come and ask, and she did, in an email that took her 4 days to write and read like it had been through a lawyer twice. I want to say clearly that I never considered saying no. There were 600 households on the other side of that fence, and most of them had never done a thing to me, and holding a water system hostage to make a point is not a thing I would be able to live with. I told Graham on the phone that same night that he could start as soon as he had crews. Then I sent Lydia my conditions, and there were 4, and they were not revenge. 1. The association pays the full cost of restoration, the temporary supply arrangement, and the fence and pasture repair. 2. The property boundary is professionally resurveyed and permanently monumented at their expense so that no future board can be confused about where their authority stops. 3. No association employee, agent, or contractor enters Boone Acre or approaches the equipment for any reason at any time. 4. Any future work touching the assembly requires written consent from me and written sign-off from the cooperative, in advance, with no exceptions and no emergency provision. The board accepted all 4 in one sitting. Their insurer had already told them what the alternative looked like. Vanessa was asked to step down as president while the board reviewed her conduct and the association's exposure. It was not dramatic. There was no shouting. A motion, a vote, a line in the minutes, and a woman who had spent 3 years deciding what this place should look like walked out of a room where nobody stood up when she left. I did not celebrate. People expect that part, and I never had it in me. I drove home, and the next morning, Graham came out with the restoration paperwork on the hood of his truck, and I signed it standing in my own pasture with the wheel still lying in the grass 40 feet away. He asked if I had any instructions for the crew. I told him just put it back where it was. The rebuild took 5 weeks, 2 longer than anyone promised, which is about right for anything involving concrete and old machinery. They saved what could be saved. The gearhead was rebuilt rather than replaced. The tail vane, snapped and bent, went to a fabricator in the next county who straightened it and re-welded the mount. And I painted it myself, white, on a Saturday, the way 3 generations of my family have painted that piece of steel. The tower sections and the drive shaft were new because there was nothing left of the old ones worth arguing about. They set the wheel on a Thursday in September. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the crane bring it up into the light, and when they pulled the brake and the sails caught, it came around slow, then steady, then found its rhythm like it had never been away. Graham called me 2 days later and said the transfer well was back at depth. The controller was holding its reference, and every pump group in the northern run was operating normally. He said it in the flat voice engineers use for good news, and then he thanked me, which he did not have to do. Red Willow Estates seated a new board in the fall. Vanessa moved off the board entirely, and she stopped driving the road past my fence, taking the longer way around to the gate instead. I have not spoken to her since the meeting. I do not need to. There is one detail I keep coming back to. 2 years earlier, the association had drawn up a plan to plant a double row of evergreens along their western edge, specifically to screen the tower out of view. The new board looked at that plan and voted to shelve it, because residents had started walking out to the trail in the evening to watch the wheel turn, and somebody had called it the oldest working thing in the county. They asked if I would be interested in a small marker, maybe a plaque, maybe a spot for people to stop. I said no, politely but no. It is not a monument, and I am not interested in it becoming a landmark or a story people tell about themselves. It is a machine my grandfather bolted together, that my father kept running, that I grease every 14 days and log in a book on a nail by the door. Vanessa thought that Windmill was the ugliest thing her neighborhood had to look at. It turned out that what she really could not see was everything that depended on it.